Welcome to Sober Dad Crew, the podcast where we talk about all things sobriety, recovery, parenting, music, tattoos, work, and more. For more information, please visit soberdadcrew.com. My guest this episode is Gabriel Kuhn. He's the author of Sober Living for the Revolution and X, Straight Edge and Radical Sobriety. All right, Gabriel, welcome to Sober Dad Crew.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I think you are my first international guest, I think. So I'm in New York where it's 7 a.m. I'm going to confess I'm not entirely awake yet, but you're a little later because you're over in Europe.
I am in Stockholm. It's 1 p.m. Thanks for getting up so early. First international guest sounds great. I'm honored.
Yeah, I wouldn't have slept that much later because I got to get kids to school, which is always the thing. And then I got to go to work because I always have to fit this in and around, the job that brings me money. I presented for Career Day at my 12-year-old school recently.
What time do the kids have to be at school?
It varies. So the 16-year-old is actually now mostly done. I have a 21-year-old too who he works. But she's mostly done now for the year. I think she has one test next week, so she doesn't have anything. And then the 8-year-old and the 12-year-old, I think it's 8:45, but the 8-year-old likes to be there at 8:30 to play kickball.
Okay.
It's a very important part of the day.
Fair enough. Yes.
Yep. But I went. Yep. So he loves kickball. I went last Friday to my 12-year-old, her career day, and I talked about podcasting, and
Wow.
Like we did a little mini podcast. We recorded a little mini podcast with the kids, but one of them was like, "Do you make a lot of money?" I said, "No, I lose money doing this I do this because I love it. It costs me money to do it." So there's this funny that young people thing that somehow you're on Spotify, so must be just like rolling up here in some fancy car and not my Mazda.
Yeah. Well, I guess, that's career day. They need to learn about those things so they can make their choices, prioritize.
Right.
Yeah.
So I want to kick off a little bit with just a definition, because we're going to talk a lot about straight edge today. And I know it's a lot more nuanced than kind of, just one definition. But for folks who don't know, can you kind of give a little just overview of what straight edge is?
I think the as you said, it can get much more technical, but I think the basics are very simple. So straight edge means that you have some kind of attachment to punk hardcore culture, but you do not take drugs, drink alcohol, or smoke tobacco or any other substances for that matter. That would be my very basic definition.
Yeah, and how long have you been straight edge?
I would have been straight edge then for, let's see, we have the year 2024, 30 plus years. Almost 35 years or something.
And have you just always been that way? Have you ever had a drink? I mean, some people kind of come into it in different ways. I have friends who are straight edge who are like, their dad was a drunk and they're like, I'm never touching a drop of that. And others kind of come into it in different ways.
Yes. Kind of close, very close to never having had a drink, but not quite. So I grew up in rural Austria, where especially boys, especially at the time when I was growing up, so in the 1980s, started drinking very early, let's say age 13, 14. And so at around that age, I had tastes of alcoholic beverages. I might have been tipsy 2 or 3 times, but then very quickly decided that I didn't want to be part of that culture. And so I've never been, when people talk about being wasted or really drunk, I've never had that experience. I never regularly drank alcohol. So yeah, I've had tastes of different whatever that was, and never liked any of them, and then just made a pretty early decision that I just didn't want to drink any alcohol.
And so, but where did sort of the straight edge, I don't know, concept, or where did you find that? Obviously, in the 80s, and you and I think are probably pretty close in age. That's when that stuff sort of started to emerge. I mean, I remember sort of becoming a punk kid. Sort of, I found the Clash, and it kind of led me, in. But I didn't have actually a lot of notion of straight edge. But or as a category, but my inclination at that time was like, why? Because to me, there's a real political component, and I exist on the left and in progressive politics. I'm like, why would you numb yourself? Right? I was like, that's exactly what sort of the power structure wants, right?
Right. So I think there are different uh, levels when it comes to answering that question. So one is that's why when you asked the question, how long have I been straight edge? So if I would set the starting point not when I decided not to drink alcohol, which was at a time when I didn't know that straight edge existed. So, but I put the starting point to where I knew that I found out that there was a straight edge movement or straight edge culture, then that would have been probably the year 89. So then we'd be at 35 years of being straight edge, and being sober would be a few extra years. So to flesh that out a little bit, as I said, I grew up in rural Austria. In the 1980s, there was no internet, so that the connection to punk hardcore was kind of step by step. Where I grew up, essentially for teenagers, there were two kinds of music to listen to. Either you were listening to the charts, pop music, or you were listening to heavy metal. And heavy metal was the rebel music. So I listened to heavy metal, and then through that, the way we got our records, because that stuff wasn't, I mean, metal was kind of playing on the radio, but certainly not punk hardcore. So to get our records, we went to Munich, across the border in Germany. And then it was, you had those bands like at the time, I suppose the Dead Kennedys, some punk bands who somehow had made their way into the metal crowd. People thought, oh, this was interesting. It's different, but it's fast and it's hard, and so that was a bridge into, okay, there is something that's not heavy metal but musically kind of similar, but politically actually more interesting. For me at the time, I was already active in the left, and so that was the discovery of punk hardcore, and then that there was a thing called straight edge within punk hardcore. That was yet another step. So it took a few years to discover that. I was at, I guess, 17, and that was great. I often say that was one of the most exciting discoveries of my life, because up until then, being sober, but at the same time moving in leftist circles, identifying as some kind of rebel of sorts, that was very odd. I didn't have any friends who were the same. All of the people I hang out with politically did drink. Smoking was really big where I grew up. So to suddenly discover that there were people similar to me in other parts of the world, but still with it seemed like very similar interests and a similar outlook and a similar take on punk hardcore and politics and sobriety, that was super exciting. So straight edge, that's why I guess to this day I have a strong attachment to that identity, with all the problems that it implies and all of that. But so that's my story.
Yeah, I don't think anything is without problems, right? Everything has sort of problematic angles, or people who kind of push things to far extremes within an identity. But I think what you're really talking about is you find your community.
Very true.
Since this is a podcast that talks about fatherhood, when we were prepping for this, and I asked you if you had kids, and you said, I have 2 kids that I'm responsible for. Can you sort of define that a little bit? I was intrigued by that.
Yeah, no, I was wondering. It's always hard to. It's kind of hard to put the right words to it, maybe. So I am part of a fairly unconventional family constellation where I am a co-parent of 2 kids. So I have a shared responsibility for those kids, but they are not my biological or legal kids.
You're
But
right.
I have been a co-parent since they were born. So they are very much part that the the parenting aspect is very much part of my life.
Yeah, and I get my version of that because my older 2 are my, quote unquote biological kids, and then my younger 2 are, what at least in the US we call stepkids in
Right,
my second marriage. But, to me, and I was even talking to this, I was having dinner with my 21-year-old this week. And he's like, they're all my siblings. It doesn't matter,
right,
like that there's blood or not. I really believe, the title dad or whatever, is earned through your actions and your role and not biology.
right. Yeah, I mean, it's all about the. I mean, and I guess especially today, and perhaps especially also living in Stockholm, you have families have become very very diverse. So it was where I grew up. It was very different. It was the more standard heterosexual nuclear family. Here there are different constellations, and I guess to some extent, of course, there's a difference between what your exact position or role is. But I think as soon as you have a relationship to children that imply a certain degree of responsibility as well as emotional attachment and everything else that is involved, you become parenting becomes part of your life, and then there are not always but often other parents, and you have to negotiate your role with theirs and all of that. But it's I guess anyone who's ever had to care for children in whatever role will say that becomes a very crucial part of what you do, and how you organize your life and what you think about and all of that.
Yeah, for sure. And the amount of spare time you have or any of those things. I mean, it's, parenting is a big job. It's a, financially, it changes your trajectory, and none of these are negatives when I say it just is the reality of parenting. Is it redefines your world and restructures your world. I mean, for me, I always kind of figured I would be a parent. Did you think that as well?
No, I actually never thought about that at all. So it just, again, the way that life, I guess, plays out, sometimes you're put in a position where you have to make choices that you didn't necessarily expect, but then that situation presents itself, and you make certain decisions, and if you take responsibility or part responsibility for children, it's a decision you then can't just easily walk away from. So it's a big decision, but it wasn't anything that I had really planned. It's something that happened because of different personal circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, I having 2 older kids and sort of being on at one point on this sort of, oh right, they're sort of getting ready to leave the house and launch and do all those things, and then I met my now wife, and I didn't ever really think I'd reparent. I knew didn't like want another baby, but I didn't really think I would be raising kids again. And then I met her, and I can't envision my life any other way. I mean, I feel like, not to be cosmic or whatever, but that the universe directed me in this way for for a reason, and that these kids are in my life and I'm in their life for a reason, and I can't picture it in in any other way.
And that's why I think some people think it's a cliche, but these questions also. But do you regret having kids, or do you regret having? It's like it becomes, the answer is, well, I don't know, because now they're here. Like, well, I don't. Yeah, it's and people think that's sort of whatever. It's kind of the cliche or cop out, but I think there is no other answer really. I mean, what's there? I guess on an abstract level, you can think about your life in very broad terms, and maybe this should have happened or this could have been done. But it's just, that's part of your reality, and it's a very, as we said before, a very important and defining part, and that's just the way it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I was a single parent, my kids were only with me every other week, and then they were, at their mother's house. I did have a little bit of a like flavor of what that was, but wasn't like I was ultimately free or just. I mean, sure, I guess I could go to more shows or something. Um, and then it was the pandemic, so I was just home with a cat,
Right.
like um but I think you're right. You can't, there's no sort of just mentally subtracting that out,
Exactly,
or,
that's kind of what I
or,
meant. Yeah.
yeah, or it's not a very healthy, like, thinking cycle if you're trying to, like, love and embrace those kids, right? If you're like, oh, well, I could be doing this or I could be doing that or whatever. I mean,
Yeah, as I said, I can't even. To me, it's even hard to imagine you know, how you'd even get there. It's kind of like if I was, I don't know. I mean, you could, well, what would I do? What would my life be like if I was 15 now and not 52? I mean, on a very abstract level, I could, yeah, maybe I'd be doing this or that. I, be on social media more, but it's kind of, it's so far removed from my reality that it becomes, to me, after like 20 seconds, it's a thought experiment that very soon becomes kind of irrelevant. Like, why? I don't know. I'm sure
yeah,
people work differently, but that's how it works for me.
and I don't think I want to be a teenager right now.
Well, that's a
I
whole other.
think I think it's so tricky now. I don't know. I mean, I guess everybody's time is tricky in its own ways. I mean, growing up being a teenager in the 80s in the Cold War, and what was a time, not necessarily, somewhat dissimilar to this time in the US, of like really very conservative, kind of radically religious politics. I mean, though the 80s now seem pretty tame, I guess, compared to the total insanity of what the U.S. with Donald Trump seems like right now. I'm like,
Right.
give me the Cold War and the threat of nuclear holocaust over Donald Trump. I think um, I'm not even sure why I'm going down this thread, but yeah. Oh, being a teenager now is tricky. I mean, social media, and kids can on their phones see where their like best friend is,
Right.
and if there was somebody else, and it just, I don't know. It's just I mean, I've grown this podcast on social media, so I can't hate on social media, but there's a lot to be said of like disconnecting.
But it's so hard. I think it's so hard to imagine what it would be like let's take this example. So I told this story about how I discovered straight edge and all of that. Now that's very much a growing up rural 1980s type story. I mean, today kids would, oh, of course, straight whatever, you do a bit of surfing on your phone wherever you are in the world, and it's like, oh, there, straight edge, what is that, so you'd, and that a lot of people I hear use that as an argument for the internet and for social media. It's like, oh, you make these discoveries and find your community much earlier. Well, to me, it's like, okay, that I get that makes sense, but there is something, and maybe that's just me, an old person romanticizing about the past, but there is something about that particular discovery that you kind of had to work for, and you did it step by step, that made it, as I said before, so special in my life, that I sometimes feel like, well, you don't now, certain things, I don't want to say they come too easily, but there's something that's also, I mean, you obviously gain something because it's so much easier to get in touch with people, but you also lose something when it comes to the process of getting there, which often in itself is quite interesting and educational. I don't know.
Yeah, I like to say to my kids, the journey matters, right? So
Right.
the road you took, and I mean, I just remember at one point going in a record store, and I don't even remember if I said to the guy, like, I like the Clash, and he put an exploited record. He's like, check this out. And that exists in this
That's so.
virtual world, and it also exists if like I have a lot of vinyl. It still exists in that world, but that was the go-to, right? It wasn't the, oh, I collect vinyl. No, you had to go to a place and buy a thing.
Oh yes, absolutely. As I said, we had to get all those records. So funny you mentioned the exploited, because when I was talking about these bands, the punk bands that sorta managed to have a bit of a metal following, the exploited was also one of the first punk bands I listened to, because some of my metal friends were like, oh, I got this one, this is interesting, check this out. But all of this, as I said, right, Grab, you only got those, right? I mean, you didn't, I guess there was mail order technically, but we didn't use any of that. It was, you had
Yeah,
to get on the train, go to Munich, go to those specific record stores where you knew they had those records, and then flip through them and listen to them at the store if they let you. And it was all a big, and again, of course, now everything is much more accessible, but I don't know, a certain mystique, let's say, is gone too.
yeah, and we're just a couple of old men reminiscing on the good old days. But I do think, and with my oldest, as he's sort of started to travel, and he loves to travel, getting out in the world with actual people and seeing how the world that's different than America and different than growing up kind of in suburban, white middle class America, and going to a place like Costa Rica where the notion of poverty is very eye opening compared to the US,
Sure.
has been so great for him. And I feel like that's your growth often comes in the real world experiences. You can't, like, the virtual world will not fill in for having a conversation with someone you meet on the street.
No, I don't think so. Then the argument is, which might be true, or is certainly true in certain circumstances, that the because of the contacts you can make in the digital world, sometimes you have more entry points, if you will, to the real world. You have more connections, and you get more ideas and inspiration. And but I would say that's on every level, even now with the political organizing that I do. And I mean, there's, especially since the pandemic, there's so many meetings online, and often it seems like, oh yeah, that these online meetings, it's really convenient. You can just sit at home. You don't have to travel somewhere to meet those people. And but I feel we just had these conversations here in my union recently, where we had a fairly organized, a fairly big, fairly expensive physical meeting with people from all over Sweden. And the consensus afterwards was that it's well worth it. Although all these people are in constant contact over video calls and email, of course, and online chats, but there is a certain quality to the personal meeting that I think cannot really be. I mean, certain aspects of it, very technical aspects, can be fulfilled through the online stuff as well. But there are certain elements that I think can't, and especially as you say, I mean, I think you can watch as many videos about a place like Costa Rica as you want, and read as many books as you want. It'll never replace the experience of being there. I just don't see that being possible.
Yeah, I want to jump into a little bit into your books, because you've written a number of books about straight edge, and a lot of them deal with sort of the radical politics of things. And I was thinking this morning, how Marx always said religion is the opiate of the masses, but I also think opiates are also, and like beer, are sort of the opiates of the masses. And I think about American politics right now, or historically, in that it super helps those in power if people are kind of numbing themselves to the broader reality and not understanding and not having the lens to actually really look and understand. Like, if you look at sort of the radical Trump supporter, who there's no reason, like financially or in any way, it makes zero sense that they're supporting this guy who, is going to take advantage of them in every way, financially has no interest in helping people who struggle economically. Like, it makes no sense. But, and it's more than just like that they have a few beers on Friday, but, the power structure is super happy to have people use alcohol and drugs. I mean, there's times in this country where, drugs were flooded into, what we call the inner city. I like to talk to those about, speak of those as more as disenfranchised communities, because,
Right.
but, there were a time where like, let's keep people using these drugs. And also then it feeds the whole prison industrial complex. I mean, that is sort of a big rambling question, but.
Right. No, I mean everything you said. I don't think any of that really is controversial. Those are just historical and sociological and political facts. So I mean the role that alcohol has played in colonization, for example, is very clear that it was used as a means to pacify people, and and if you look also at radical revolutionary movements, that aspect, or alcohol, drugs as oppression tools, that is always a part. It's always part of the agenda. What people are pointing out. Um, I think where the discussion then starts between, let's say, sober, non sober activists or militants or radicals, and the straight edge thing is does that mean that the only answer to that is sobriety, or does it just mean that it's some kind of moderate use of alcohol, because that's not that bad, right? And it also has its, to some people, I suppose, positive effects, like what do they call it, like a social something that helps, social contact or whatever.
Right.
I mean, arguments that to me personally were never convincing, because I personally always just saw the negative sides of it. But I understand that people, see it differently. So there, I think you can have different opinions, but I really don't think that you could seriously question the role of uh, alcohol and drugs as oppression tools the way you described it. That's just part of history. I think that's very well documented.
Yeah, and I think a part of it for me too is, and I remember sort of in college being frustrated by environmentalists who were smoking and thinking, the companies like Philip Morris and these companies, these are nasty big corporations. And, Anheuser-Busch on the alcohol side. And, a lot of those companies in the US, as marijuana is becoming legal here, were quietly sort of buying up properties, so they were ready to also just make that into one giant commodified thing too. And I legalization is a complicated issue, and I don't want people going to jail, for using substances. It's
Right.
not really a useful way for people to get healthy. But I think part of it for me is, especially with alcohol and cigarettes and now marijuana in the US, that have become they're really corporate money making tools.
Sure.
And so you're supporting these big corporations with that too, which is sort of anti kind of radical politics, or at least against trying to like create a more
Mm.
humane world.
I think what it shows is just the addictive nature of these things. I thought about that quite often because it's obvious that in certain circles, people who are who see it as part of their politics to boycott certain corporations that they see as particularly evil expressions of the capitalist world, whether it's McDonald's or Nike or whatever it might be. Um, if you're not addicted to your Nike sneakers, if you're not addicted to McDonald's fries or whatever, it's relatively easy to make those decisions. It's okay. I don't, I'm not going to buy anything there. I'm not going to give them any money. Um, but if I think for a lot of people, the sacrifice of not drinking that beer that's on offer and not smoking those cigarettes becomes much bigger because there is that addictive element to it. That's, I think, the biggest reason for why we see this contradiction in how people respond to companies, corporations in different industries. Because I mean, I share your experience. It's like sometimes it's like, why would you? Every political argument that you use goes against you drinking that Budweiser right now. So there's got to be a particular reason to why you're making an exception in this particular case, and I just think it is there's that addictive element that just makes it hard.
Yeah, and it's not like I'm without sin, right? I mean, I drive a car every day,
Right.
right? So
Well,
I'm
none of us is, of course.
right, so I'm putting fuel in that car and in driving to my office or driving my kids around, and I live in a more rural area, so it would not be easy to just be like, I'm giving up my car.
Right.
That's not like a practical solution. Right. None of us are perfect and we all have contradictions, and it's okay. But I feel like trying to minimize those contradictions when you're trying to make a better world is a helpful approach.
Yeah, I would say, and I mean, obviously, it's not about sinning anyway, right? So we're not.
Yeah.
This is not a religious purity contest or anything like that. But I would agree that especially if you have a sort of criticism of corporate capitalism and just even as a symbolic gesture, you don't want to put your money into big corporations that would entail alcohol and the alcohol, tobacco, and now with the legalization, I suppose there's also a bigger official corporate uh, marijuana industry. Yes, you wouldn't want to put your money there either. Uh, I'd agree with that as a political stance.
This is sort of a pivot just to talk about your books a little more. What was the driving force behind wanting to get some books out there and sort of bring this concept more widely to folks?
I think it wasn't primarily about promoting straight edge as such. So the in English we're talking mainly about two books. So one is Sober Living for the Revolution, Hardcore Punk, Straight Edge, and Radical Politics. And then there is a kind of follow up volume which is called X, Straight Edge and Radical Sobriety. And the motivation behind Sober Living, which came out in 2010, I believe, was to show the progressive radical currents within the straight edge movement. So straight edge in itself, just as sobriety in itself, I think can go into all sorts of political directions. Historically, sobriety has been very strongly tied to We already talked about Puritanism, conservatism, religious ideas and principles. It has later also been adopted uh, politically for very similar political reasons. So you got to be conscious and aware, and that's all good for left wing activists. But a lot of people on the right see it in a similar way. So there have been these far right adaptations of straight edge. Um, Plus, there's always been a bit of, and that I guess comes from hardcore punk in general. There's always been a very sort of a macho element to it. So my motivation to do sober living was to say that, look, I see all of those currents, I see all of those problems, but there is another side to straight edge as well. So not everyone who's straight edge is a macho guy who goes to the gym and thinks he's better than anyone else. It's more diverse than that, more complex than that. There are better reasons for being straight edge than that. And I wanted to document that history. And that was the motivation for that first book. And then the second book, which came out, X, which came out 10 years later, was partly just a continuation of that. But I also felt that in the between 2010 2020, the straight edge culture diversified even more. So there was it seemed worthwhile to sort of document those latest developments. And then there were some people pointed out not necessarily shortcomings of the first book of Sober Livings, but certain aspects that they felt weren't dealt with enough, or that they would have also wanted to read about. For example, uh, how or if straight edge can help people in recovery. That was a big aspect. Also, even sober living is fairly international, but there was I think Access has even more of a sort of international outlook. So I felt there was something to add. I mean, we even discussed with the publisher whether the second volume should just be called, Sober Living for the Revolution 2. but for different reasons, we then decided to give it a different name. Also because it brings in a bit of this radical sobriety element, which I think was fairly new, so that political radicals embraced sobriety as an important concept, but for different reasons didn't want to associate with straight edge, either because they didn't have any connection to hardcore punk, or because they still saw it kind of as a sort of holier than thou type thing, whatever their reasons were. So I wanted to bring those elements into the discussion too. So people with a strong political leftist radical take on straight edge, and certain on sobriety, and certain sympathies with straight edge, but who didn't necessarily see themselves as part of the culture. So
Yeah, because if the recovery piece, I think, is important. I mean, a lot of people I talk to on here, no one has. Well, one guy sort of was, re-edge, as they say. Had kind
right,
of been a straight edge punk kid, and I think this is pretty common. You get older, you get the job, you do the thing, you kind of fall into these work cultures, and this isn't a criticism of like people changing. That's just life, and then you develop, like in my case, an unhealthy relationship with alcohol. With I describe it as sort of medicinal quality, and saying like, okay, like this has got to go. And when I did that, like rethinking about straight edge sort of helped me in that process. It helped me define it at a time when I didn't feel comfortable maybe saying recovery to people, publicly. Yeah, I guess that was more of a statement than a question, but I think that's an interesting thread. That piece is like, what is straight edge's role, or the notion of radical sobriety in the recovery process?
right. And I think it was really interesting also to me, because admittedly I never or never. When I was younger and was into straight edge, I didn't think about those aspects much at all, to be honest. It was more about the identity of being sober, and as you said, finding your community. And but the question, and I think it's a very, very interesting, also very challenging question, like what can, you know, what, if anything, can straight edge do to support people who struggle with addictions? Because a lot of those, I mean, those slogans, the straight edge slogans that were around in the 80s and 90s, true till death, and watching you fall only makes me stronger, and I
Yeah.
mean, those are not great entry points.
Right. They're also just hyper masculine, right? Just
Exactly.
like very broy.
Exactly. So if you wanna be like, look, with that sort of experience of being straight edge, I feel like I might have something to offer to people to who are struggling with addiction. Your approach has to be very, very different. I mean, there's got to be much more of a, whatever you want to call it. There's needs to be a element of understanding, compassion, if people want to use that word, uh, much rather than this, like, oh, what's your problem? That's you made bad choices in your life. What can I do? You know what I mean? So, which again makes, in terms of when you think about, so what can straight edge do for society beyond providing a sense of identity and community for sober people, then that becomes a very interesting, very challenging question. And I don't have personally really particularly good answers, but I do think that X contains a few pieces by people who've had personal experiences with that I feel are very, very interesting and inspiring.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I was just rereading X this week, sort of preparing. Then I realized I own 2 copies of it.
All right, there you go.
So I have to figure out someone to gift the copy to.
I hope that won't be too difficult.
Yeah, the record store I go to in Ithaca is above PM Press bookstore.
Oh, interesting.
So
Yeah.
like it's got a super cool selection of stuff, and I walked by, I was like, oh, I don't think I have this book by Gabriel, because I have a lot of books, like I have a lot of records. It happens in your life, right? Where you kind of
Yeah,
forget
right.
all the things you have, and you read enough, you're like, oh, did I read that? And so I bought another copy, and I was like, oh, look, there's it on the shelf.
Okay, well, now you have a present for someone. How's that bookstore? I've never been, and it's opened a couple of years ago, I believe.
That is a great bookstore. It used to be a bookstore called Autumn Leaves for a long time, and then PM bought it at one point. There was always like a kind of left element, but there's definitely more, I think, influx of like the PM titles and a more radical politics. I would say the
Okay.
staff has gotten more punk than hippie.
Oh
It
yeah,
was a little
right.
more hippie before. Now it's a little more punk. So like that resonates with me. It's like a kind of a younger staff, which is cool too. Yeah, it's a good little outpost. Ithaca's not a big place, but it's a college town. So it used to be a town that had so many bookstores. I guess like that's the rest of the world, and it still has a few, but it's the only really used one around.
Sure. What's the staff like at the record store upstairs? Is that also more punky or?
Yeah, it's kind of a mix. I mean, it's those guys are great. I actually interviewed one of them for this.
Okay.
It's very record store. There's a lot of like hyper detailed conversations about certain pressings and all that stuff, which if you do
Yeah. Okay.
vinyl and go to those stores, I'm not like that. I don't need like this super pressing of this album. Like I want albums of people that I love, or buying
Sure.
vinyl as a way to support small bands.
Right.
But it's a good place. They get a lot of big collections in. I've been able to buy a lot of good jazz there, which is nice.
Okay.
So
Good.
it's a cool place. It's a good little outpost. It's a mile from my office, so when I take an afternoon walk, I can kind of like go down there and
Nice.
flip through the bins a little bit or whatever.
Very nice.
Well, this was awesome. I super appreciate, you taking the time and, being on from overseas and all that and dealing with the 6-hour time difference.
Well, it was harder to deal with it for you, it seems like, but I hope you're more awake now, getting the kids to school. Thanks for inviting me and for being ready so early.
Thanks for listening. Sober Dad Crew is a DIY project by Stephen Kimball, who writes, edits, and produces the show. To support the show, please review it where you listen to podcasts or visit SoberDadCrew.com to buy some merchandise or make a donation.